Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. For your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is that we've decided to talk about. My guest tonight, again, is Dan Meek. Important attorney who works very hard on issues important to ordinary citizens. He's been on a number of times in the past, but it's been a while now, so we're going to do the standard procedure of talking about who he is personally before we get into the meat of the show. The title of the show is What's Important? No, Topical Issues as of 2012-02-09. And there's certainly a lot of topical issues that we'll talk about. Thanks for coming on again, Dan. And I had to press him into service because they had a cancellation for tonight's show. So on short notice, he showed up, and I really appreciate that.
No problem.
And he was a little unhappy with me because I didn't have a hookup for his computer. And he claims that he can't talk about important things without his computer. And I'm here to prove that he can.
I can talk, but it's much more interesting to show my graphs.
Okay. So let's start off with the basic you-know-who what. And your full name is?
Daniel Meek.
Daniel
Wilson Meek.
Daniel Wilson. How'd you get a middle name Wilson?
That's just my mother's maiden name.
Uh-huh. If I were to ask your best friend, who is Dan Meek, what would he or she say?
He's a public interest lawyer who represents public interest groups and progressive political causes.
Wow! How long have you been doing that?
Well, I've been in private practice doing that since 1987, the beginning of '87. So I guess that would be about 34 years at least. 24 years.
That's a wow.
I graduated from law school in 1978, so I've been a lawyer for 34 years.
You started off very young. You don't look that old.
I was when I was the youngest member of the class that I was in at Stanford Law School. I know that because when I got there, I had a group of friends, and they would go off to eat dinner. After class, they'd go off to eat dinner at a pub, for example.
Yeah.
And so I'd get carded at the door. I was the only one under 21, so I couldn't stay. So my dinners usually consisted of frozen pot pies that I would cook on a little burner in the basement of the dormitory. But it did free up a lot of time because I wasn't out drinking beer or anything. So I had
rats. You missed that.
It was easier to study that way.
Okay.
But the real key to my education, though, was my undergraduate school, University of Wyoming, up there in Laramie, about 7,700 feet high, and really, it was a great place to go. I went there because they recruited me for their intercollegiate debate program, which was one of the best in the country. So I spent most of the 3 years I was there traveling around the country doing intercollegiate debate and tournaments and that sort of thing.
Did you enjoy that?
Very much. And I also met a lot of folks that I have since had things to do with ever since then. In particular, my colleague and I particularly liked to debate the top team from MIT. And
really?
we did well. Of course, we were in the top 10, certainly the top 10 teams in the country. The others were like UCLA, USC, Harvard was, Dartmouth, and then some strange places you might not expect. Emory, Kansas, Wyoming was probably the least expected. But we particularly liked debating the team from MIT, and we did several times because we never lost to MIT. We always beat MIT. And the lead debater for MIT during the years I was there was a guy named Larry Summers.
That name is familiar.
Yes, who he then became, of course, Treasury Secretary and and professor, president of Harvard, for that matter. So, but we always like debating Larry because we always won.
Are you a Mensa member?
No.
Why not?
No, just not interested.
You have the IQ, don't you?
Probably, but
Yeah.
who knows?
How did you arrive at being the kind of a lawyer that you are? I mean, that's kind of unique to be that progressive and working for those kinds of people who need the kind of help that you provide.
It is unusual. I don't know of anyone besides my colleague Linda Williams who makes a living just being, being an attorney for causes. And how we primarily make our living is by suing utilities for cheating ratepayers, in finding instances where utilities break the law on a large scale and sue them and try to get the money back for ratepayers. Why? I don't know. I recall in junior high writing an essay on my hero at the time, Ralph Nader, and I've had the, of course, privilege be privileged to know Ralph and to work with him on various projects.
You did, huh?
Sure.
And yeah.
So, but probably the reason that I went down this course was probably growing up as a non-Mormon in a very predominantly Mormon culture.
You are odd.
Yes. You see, now that Mitt Romney's on the scene and he's saying people shouldn't discriminate against him because he's Mormon, which of course I agree with. But when I grew up, I was certainly discriminated against because I was not Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
In applying, like as a teenager and applying for a job anywhere, the first question is, what ward are you in?
Really now?
Sure. And if I'm not in a ward, well, and of course, the parents of my girlfriends were not at all pleased. Not at all pleased that I wasn't a very promising prospect. I'll tell you that.
So, what year were you born in? Did you tell me?
1953.
53. Yeah. Why were you born?
Why?
Yes.
Well, I guess that was the proximate cause was that my mother had her fallopian tubes blown.
Really?
My mother was almost 43 when she had me, and she could not have. She thought she couldn't have children, but then a doctor finally said, "Well, your fallopian tubes are blocked," and so blew them out when she was about 41, and she immediately had 2 children.
I'll be darned! Isn't that interesting?
Yep.
And where's your sibling?
My sister Melody lives in near San Bernardino, California.
What does she do?
She is she and her husband have a real estate development business. They buy property and they build houses and apartments.
Is she as smart as you are?
Probably, yes.
Okay. Any significant?
I also have another sister who lives here in Portland. Valerie.
Is she smart too?
Oh yes.
God, who'd you get it from? Your mom or your dad, or both?
Probably both.
Mm-hmm.
I would say both.
Okay. And anything significant about your cultural heritage that's worth telling the viewers about?
Well, I'm almost entirely Welsh on both sides of the family. On my mother's side of the family, I can trace my great-great-grandparents, all of whom came from a small town in Wales, the same small town, Monmouth. And they all, as very young adults, got on a ship in Liverpool, provided by the Mormon Church, and sailed to America, took the train out to Chicago, got to Nauvoo, Illinois. There were no oxen left for the trek to Utah, so they were part of the handcart trek, where they put their belongings in a cart, and then they performed the function of the oxen and pulled the cart from Illinois to Utah. Most of the carts were abandoned along the way because it just became too difficult to pull them through the snow. So,
and there are good enough records for you to have that information.
Oh yes, sure.
I'll be darned. Yeah. And a religious preference, is that a fair question?
Well, I'm an atheist, period.
And you have a partner?
Yes, Linda Williams.
Yeah, okay, I was going to ask you about that. Children?
No, I don't have. She does.
And are you a Tea Party member, or how are you on the political continuum? Left or right or center or what?
I was thinking about that Tea Party, but probably the best indication of that is that I was one of the founders in Oregon of the Progressive Party. And so that's the party that is, on a conventional political scale, you would say far to the left of the Democratic Party. And I would say it is a populist kind of party. It's for the average person. It's not for the wealthy. It's not for big corporations. It's for the average person who's trying to make a living.
How did you happen to take up that to establish or be a part of starting the Progressive Party in Oregon?
Well, it became clear to me in dealing with utilities in the 1980s and 90s that whenever, sometimes when we would find utilities breaking the law and overcharging ratepayers by amounts that really were hundreds of millions of dollars in Oregon, we would sue them, and then their typical response would be to run down to the Oregon legislature to have the law changed retroactively. So to say that what they did that was illegal under the law at the time would be retroactively deemed legal. So it became clear that I had to have some influence at the legislature, but of course I found that I didn't, because the the people of Oregon enacted, for example, limits on campaign contributions so that the legislature wouldn't be bought and sold by large corporations and wealthy individuals. They enacted those limits in 1908, but to my surprise, the Oregon legislature repealed them in 1973. Just before Watergate, the Oregon legislature repealed limits on campaign contributions. The next year, of course, the U.S. Congress enacted limits on campaign contributions for federal races for Congress and the president. So Oregon went in exactly the wrong direction. So by the time I was working with against the utilities, I found that Oregon had no limits on political contributions, and so the utilities could just fork over money to the candidates and basically get their way. The people of Oregon then in 1994 again enacted good limits on political contributions, but the corporations took them to court under the guise of a free speech organization, and the Oregon Supreme Court struck down those limits in 1997. So again, we were faced in a regime of no limits. Since then, since 1997, the amount of money spent by candidates on political races in Oregon, both statewide and for the legislature, increased from $4.2 million to over $50 million. So it's increased by a factor of 12 since 1996. And now currently, of course, in the last governor's race, the candidates spent $20 million running for governor. And in the legislature, it now typically costs $600,000 to $700,000 to win a seat either in the Oregon House or in the Senate, in any kind of a contested race. So it usually amounts to around $50, $60, or $70 a vote, which is actually the third highest. The spending in Oregon on legislative races per capita is the third highest in the United States.
Isn't that democracy?
I don't think so. I think that...
Isn't money speech?
No. In fact, we might get into the fact the Oregon Supreme Court now, 2009, a couple of years ago, in fact, made the opposite statement. It said that transfers of property are not expression, which is another way of saying money is not speech. But in any event, it became clear that basically candidates in Oregon are selected for public office by pleasing large donors. It's only the pleasing candidate who attracts the large contributions that are now necessary to persuade voters through 30-second television and radio ads, etc.
Pleasing who?
Pleasing the large donors.
Okay.
So then I got involved in in campaign finance reform in Oregon and helped put the Measure 47 on the ballot in 2006. And we passed that measure in 2006. It has very strict limits on contributions and independent expenditures. But the Oregon Secretary of State and Attorney General have refused to enforce it.
Refused to enforce?
Refused to enforce it, even though no court has found any part of it to be unconstitutional.
How can they do that?
Well, I think it's outrageous, and so we sued them, and that case finally got heard by the Oregon Supreme Court about a month ago, and now we are awaiting the Oregon Supreme Court decision on that, which I would expect to come out within the next couple of months. If Measure 47 is enforced, then and candidates for statewide office, for example, instead of being able to take contributions literally in the millions, in the last governor's race, the Republican candidate, Chris Dudley, received over $1 million from the Republican National Governors Association by itself. Mm-hmm. And in those races, it is not unusual for individuals to give $300,000 or $400,000. Typically, they are executives of corporations, and in Oregon, they are mostly executives of corporations involved with timber companies and logging, etc. On the other side, the labor unions gave Governor Kitzhaber many hundreds of thousands of dollars, collectively many millions of dollars. So under Measure 47, that there are no corporate contributions allowed, no union contribution allowed. Individuals can give to a statewide person running for statewide office $500 in the primary and $500 in the general election. Mm-hmm. So we await to see if the Supreme Court is going to compel the Secretary of State and Attorney General to enforce the law.
What do you think is going to happen?
I think they will do that. And then the corporations and the lobbyists will have to challenge this law as unconstitutional, and I believe our law will be upheld.
And when it goes to the Supreme Court, what will happen?
What
will Roberts do?
If you're talking about the U.S. Supreme Court,
yes,
there are elements of our law that in cases that were decided since our law passed in 2006. The U.S. Supreme Court has found unconstitutional in other contexts. For example, one thing that our measure does is ban all corporate independent expenditures, and in state and local races. That will be the problem. And that's of course what the Supreme Court struck down on the federal level in the Citizens United case in 2010. However, we anticipated that would happen. So in Measure 47, what we say is that all these independent expenditures are banned, but if for any reason they occur, then any independent expenditure campaign spending more than $1,000 has to identify in each ad that is financed by the campaign, has to identify the top 5 contributors, the businesses the primary businesses they are engaged in, and how much each of them has contributed to the campaign during this 2-year election cycle. So, in an ad, let's say financed by timber company executives, instead of saying, paid for by the Healthy Forest people, or not even identifying who paid for it.
Some lovely title to it, right?
Right. They'll have to say
paid
for by Weyerhaeuser and Georgia Pacific and whomever else, Seneca Lumber, whomever else is paying for it, or paid for by Rod Wendt, who's president of Geldwind, and the primary business is lumber products, timber products, and so that'll take up a lot of time, obviously, to say that on the air, and it will also, I think, cause many independent expenditure ads to backfire. That is, once you know who's really putting them on, then you can evaluate their motives and their credibility.
And you think the citizenry will have the ability to make that sort of a judgment?
Well, I think it will improve their ability to make the judgment.
Of course.
That is, instead of just seeing, they might run an ad saying, this guy is a great candidate for governor, he's wonderful, brought to you by, good things for good people, or brought to you by a bunch of drug company executives. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it makes a difference. And if, as long as we have to live under the regime of the current 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court, then that may be the best we can do. I think one interesting thing is the fact that we could see in 2000, we actually drafted this measure in 2004, we could see Citizens United coming down the road, mainly, and of course the U.S. Supreme Court itself telegraphed what it was going to do fully a year in advance by taking the Citizens United case, sending it back for additional briefing on broader issues. Mm-hmm. And what's really irksome to me is that during all of 2010, when folks knew that 2009, mm-hmm. when folks knew Citizens United was going to come down the road in 2010, the Democrats had very large majorities in both houses of the U.S. Congress. They had about 60% majority in the House, and they had 60% majority in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And they didn't do anything about it. Even after Citizens United came down in January of 2010, the Democrats still had those majorities. The Democrats still had the big majorities until the beginning of 2011.
Why didn't they do anything about it?
Even after Citizens United was decided, they had a full year to do something about it, and they didn't. They could have done a number of things. They could have passed a law, for example, to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 11.
Like FDR tried to do?
Right. FDR, by the way, succeeded in his strategy. When he proposed to enlarge the court, within a few weeks, 2 of the existing members of the Supreme Court started changing their opinions in decisions involving New Deal programs. They'd been striking down New Deal programs, and suddenly they saw the light and decided that the Works Projects Administration and other New Deal programs were just dandy, which derailed the court packing plan of FDR, but it actually became unnecessary. Mm-hmm. But the number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court is purely up to Congress.
Yes. It's
been as few as 6 and as many as 11. Mm-hmm. They can change it if they want to, but they didn't even try. If President Obama were to appoint 2 more justices of the ilk that he had been appointing, then Citizens United could have been reheard and reversed. It would have been 6-5 the other way. In addition, Congress, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, the cases that the Supreme Court is allowed to hear, is also a function of Congress. And Congress has passed many laws saying that the Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction to review certain laws in certain categories or certain specific laws. They could have done the same thing. They could have said the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction to review or strike down campaign finance reform statutes. But they didn't do that. What the Democrats did try to do, it was called the Disclose Act, which said, well, if you're going to have all these, if you're going to have totally unlimited independent expenditures by corporations, at least we should know which corporations it's coming from. And so they came up with this Disclose Act that you have to disclose the name of the corporation and that sort of thing. Because now you don't even have to do that. Mm. So that passed the House of Representatives, and then it went to the Senate, where the vote in favor of it was 59 to 41. Therefore, it lost. How can it lose when 59 out of 100 senators voted for it?
It isn't the majority that counts, right?
Well, because the Democrats allowed that vote to be a cloture vote. That is,
2/3.
They allowed it to be a vote on shutting off debate. And under the Senate rules, in order to shut off debate, it requires 60 votes. Now, that is merely a Senate rule that can be changed by the Senate. In fact, it can be changed at any time. Just late in 2011, the Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid, actually pulled out and used what's called the nuclear option. That is, shutting off debate on a pure majority vote. He did that on some trivial bill. I can't even remember what it was about. But that's what some folks were urging the Democrats to do in 2010 when they had a 59-vote majority in the Senate. Once the chair of the Senate says, okay, there's 59 votes to cut off debate, that's not 60, so the motion fails, bang, they should have done what Harry Reid did a few months ago. He said, I suggest that having a 60-vote requirement is, is unconstitutional. And then it becomes, and then that issue, whether to sustain the ruling of the chair, becomes a majority vote. So the Democrats could have eliminated the Citizens United decision if they wanted to, but they didn't want to.
Why didn't they? Why didn't they want to do that?
Up until that point, before the campaign season for 2010 got underway, the Democrats for the last few election cycles had actually been receiving more corporate money than the Republicans.
Really?
Really. So they weren't all, the Democratic establishment wasn't all that upset about Citizens United, More corporate money? Oh, good. More money for us.
Holy Moses.
So they didn't do anything about it. I think that was a severe miscalculation. And because, of course, faced with the choice between contributing money to the campaigns of folks who support you 100%, versus folks who only support you 90%, obviously the corporations are going to go for the 100%ers, and that's the Republicans, which is what they did, and that's how they bought the House of Representatives.
Do we have a democracy in this country anymore?
No, we don't.
Oh boy.
We don't.
Let's continue on with our general questions for a bit before we continue with this more detailed stuff, all right? Do you have any memberships in political, social, or civic organizations worth mentioning? You remember the Trial Lawyers Association or something?
No.
Right.
I identify with the Progressive Party, I would say.
And we kind of, you got to know Ralph Nader. We'll talk about that later on, I guess, some more.
Okay.
Any persons from the past or alive today that you like or admire? Any names come to mind?
Well, the more I read about him, the more inspirational Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes.
Really?
And where he had the courage to confront the kind of economic power that President Obama doesn't confront.
How about his wife, Eleanor? What do you think of her?
Don't know too much about Eleanor, but she was probably also a very a highly admirable person. There was one thing that that particularly struck me about something that a president said in the past, who said, oops, I can't find it, but you'll remember that when Roosevelt was running in 1936 for re-election, he said that of the corporate establishment, he said that never before have they been so united in their hatred for one candidate.
And I welcome
their hatred. And then, to contrast with what President Obama has recently said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to Republicans and I'm going to say, what can we work on together? There are going to be some things that we can't agree on, philosophically. Then he was asked, the press asked him, well, haven't you tried that? Well, I have, but I'm going to keep on trying.
My control room is going to yell at me if I don't stop for a break. So let's take a break for a few minutes and then we'll resume our discussion, all right? You're back. Thanks for staying tuned. And for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is that we have decided to talk about tonight. And my guest tonight is Dan Meek. He's just a delightfully interesting guy, and he's been on a number of times in the past. And we talked about who he is personally, and now we're going to get into the meat of the show and topical issues. And Dan has some topical issues he wants to talk about. I think we chatted about this before the camera started rolling. Dan, what do you want to start talking about first of all?
Well, this is sort of the things I'm most recently working on.
Of course.
The Oregon legislature is in its off-year session, or its even-year session. It wasn't enough that they meet for 7 or 8 months every 2 years. They decided that they needed to meet also in the even-numbered years, and got the Oregon Constitution changed to do that.
So you go to Salem more often than before?
Unfortunately, that's the case. And in Salem, because, as I mentioned, we have no campaign finance reform, and because it costs nearly, easily over $500,000 to get elected to the House or Senate in any kind of a contested race, the folks who are in the legislature generally are not sympathetic to my causes. But we had a kind of a strange, at least temporary victory the other day, when I noticed that, the off-year session, this is called the off-year session, I guess, even, and is supposed to deal with budget matters. That was the reason for it, that the economy changes so quickly, and Oregon, it depends on the income tax, which, by the way, Oregon has just about the highest income taxes on people living at the poverty level of any state of the United States. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
We have the 3rd lowest taxes of any state on business operations, on corporations. But we have the 3rd highest taxes on a family of 4 living at the poverty level. Now Oregon has a progressive reputation, but I think it is not deserved at all, because Oregon has an extremely regressive way of raising funds on the state level.
Really? I didn't know that.
And the state budget, of course, is much larger than it used to be, because various property taxation measures over the past 20 years, a little over 20 years, have shifted the vast majority of funding for schools from the local level to the state level. And so, of course, the state gets most of its money from income taxes. And as I say, we have very high income taxes on people living near poverty, and very low income taxes on businesses. In fact, the proportion of the state budget paid for by corporate income taxes has gone down from 19% 25 years ago to 5% now.
5%.
In addition, their contribution to property tax revenue in the state has been cut in half over the past 15 years. How'd that happen? It happened because the amount of money that I saw in the paper the other day that somebody said the best investment you can make is buying politicians. Well, the amount of money that the corporations have spent on political candidates in Oregon has skyrocketed. As I said, we're now the 3rd highest in the nation. And so they get their way. They get their way in the form of low taxes, except not on people living near the poverty level don't make political contributions. In fact, 99% of Oregonians make no political contributions, and so they're the ones who get to pay a higher price. Are you working on getting the money out of the political process? Yes, of course. In every session we suggest doing that, but the Oregon legislature has never limited political campaign contributions. Absolutely never. The only time they've ever been limited in Oregon is when it's been done by initiative. And of course, another high priority of the legislature over the past decade or so has been to make the initiative process more difficult and more expensive, so people cannot limit political contributions. Limit democracy, huh? Right. Back in the year 2000, for example, there were 9 measures on the ballot that I think anyone would say were progressive measures. The number of progressive measures on the Oregon ballot in 2008 was 1 or 0. In 2010 was 0, unless you consider the medical marijuana dispensaries progressive, in which case it was 1, and this year will probably be 0. Back in the 1980s, when we were able to put statewide measures on the ballot for for disposal of radioactive waste, that sort of thing, cost us around $20,000 or $25,000 to put a statewide measure on the ballot, is to get the signatures that were necessary. But since then, the legislature and the secretaries of state have imposed such ridiculous technical requirements that most volunteers don't follow. It typically costs to get a measure on the ballot $400,000.
Oh my gosh!
Which, of course, the progressive causes don't have. Well, who has the money to put that kind of measure on the ballot? Well, the tobacco companies do. The folks who want to reduce property taxes or capital gains taxes do. And the potential casino owners do. So basically now the only kind of ballot measures you see in Oregon are tax limitations and gambling. Mm-hmm. That's because those are the folks who have the money to put the measures on the ballot, thanks to an avalanche of ridiculous technical requirements imposed by Secretaries of State and the legislature.
Before we're through tonight, you're going to tell me what we can do to change these things you're talking about that are so outlandish.
Well, that's what the Progressive Party is about. That is, it also became clear to me that there aren't real choices in Oregon when it comes to selecting people to serve in public office. You either get the corporate candidate, the 100% corporate candidate, or the 80% corporate candidate, but that's it. What folks can do is support the Progressive Party of Oregon, and we will be nominating more candidates. We of course nominated a candidate for the special election to fill the seat that David Wu vacated in Congress. Our candidate, Stephen Reynolds, got about 3.5% of the vote at a cost of $1,000. We spent $1,000 on the campaign. So his votes came in at about 14 cents a vote. The Democratic candidate and party spent $3.5 million on that seat, on that race. The Republican Party and candidate spent about $1.5 million. So the Democratic vote came in at cost them about $30 a vote to win that race, and that's a typical amount of spending in congressional races these days. But I was talking about this session of the legislature. It's supposed to deal with budget matters, but instead they took the time to have a hearing on Senate Bill 1534, which would make it a Class C felony for anyone, for example, to send an email to two other persons, or to use Twitter or Facebook or anything else, to send a message, quote, with the intent of causing two or more other persons to engage in specific conduct constituting a crime. And the strange thing about this bill was that if you suggested to two other persons by email that they commit a misdemeanor, the mere suggestion of committing the misdemeanor is itself a Class C felony. Now, under state law, there are many misdemeanors which basically apply to civil disobedience. For example, it's a misdemeanor under Oregon state law to make an unreasonable noise, to obstruct vehicular or pedestrian traffic on a public way, or to congregate with other persons in a public place and refuse to comply with a lawful order of the police to disperse, or to abuse a venerated object, meaning a public monument or structure, or the national or state flag, or to knowingly enter and remain unlawfully in or on a public transit vehicle or public transit station. So civil disobedience type of offenses in Oregon are misdemeanors. Mm-hmm. But this proposal, which was co-sponsored by 10 Republicans and 2 Democrats in the Senate, it only requires 16 to pass. They already had 12 co-sponsors. That would make suggesting, let's say I'm watching TV and I see that the Occupy folks are in downtown Portland, Pioneer Courthouse Square, and the police have told them to leave and they're not leaving. So let's say I email to you and one other person, let's go down there and join them. Well, under this law, I've committed a felony.
Oh my
That's punishable by 5 years in prison and a fine up to $125,000.
Sieg Heil.
That's right. So I went to the hearing, and there were a very advantageous byproduct of or product of the Occupy movement is that there were a dozen folks from the Occupy movement there to testify against it as well. And the sponsor of the bill, Senator Doug Whitsitt, he introduced it by saying, well, the purpose of this is to help stop the use of the internet to organize robberies at jewelry stores and banks.
Jewelry stores and banks. help me out here. What the hell is going on?
Well, you know, what happens is that there are these things called flash mobs, and they're organized on the internet, and they say, let's go rob this jewelry store at 10 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever. Well, as I pointed out to the committee, robbing banks or jewelry stores or anything for that matter isn't a misdemeanor. So why do you make it a felony to suggest the commission of a misdemeanor? You know, misdemeanors are like civil disobedience. They're not robbing jewelry stores or banks. And there's no answer to that.
Your work will be forever interesting.
So that bill was quickly placed in the round file, and presumably will not go any further.
Do you deal with many like that?
Yes. Well, let me put in the last session, in the 2011 session, there was a bill that passed the Oregon Senate by a vote of 29-0, and what it did is it changed the fines for campaign finance reporting violations. And it said that if, no matter how many reporting violations you had in a given month, let's say you didn't report anything for a given month, let's say your campaign took in millions of dollars, as gubernatorial campaigns do in a given month, usually, July, August, September, and you just didn't report any of that. You didn't follow any of the laws to report the sources of your contributions. Under current law, you would be required to pay a fine of 10% of the amount that you didn't report.
Sure.
I think that's too low, but let's say that you didn't report $2 million. Well, 10% of that is $200,000 in a fine. I think that's perfectly appropriate, if not too low. The bill that passed the Oregon Senate 29-0 said the limit on fines that you can be charged, no matter how many violations you have in any given month, is $5,000. So you could tell your supporters, hey, send me your checks in August, because I'm not going to report anything in August. So you could take in an unlimited amount of money in August in campaign contributions, never report them, all secret, and pay a $5,000 fine. So I found out about that after it passed the Senate, and I was lucky enough to get Jeff Mapes of the Oregonian interested in this. The legislature, one of the reporters for the Oregonian at the legislature. So he wrote a story about it, and then it went to the House, and the House committee. I testified against it in the House committee. House committee, unanimously sends it to the House floor. So it looks like it's going to pass because the fix is in. And so it goes to the House floor, and curiously enough, the vote on the House floor was 54-5 against it.
And these are two houses in the government.
Right.
And how can they see?
Because as long as it was being done without public scrutiny, it passed unanimously in the Senate.
Oh, wow.
But as soon as there was an article about it on the front page of Metro in the Oregonian, then the light of day defeated it. So those things happen rarely, but they do sometimes happen. And I think that the Occupy movement is going to be quite valuable in helping to highlight these sorts of things.
Yeah. You want to say something about the Occupy movement?
Well, I think that it's a very interesting and helpful movement. I've been getting involved in their policy discussions. They need to be for something, and I think their message so far has been, that there are great disparities of income and wealth, and that the political system and economic system is rigged, and I agree with that. And what I'm trying to do is translate that energy into taking stands on specific issues, and in this legislature taking stands on specific bills. And the interesting thing is that they do command a lot of press, and I think it's because they're so action-oriented. That is, they're willing to go out on the streets and to get their head smashed for a cause, which is something that hasn't happened in the United States for a long time. Basically,
Since Vietnam.
Well, Vietnam, and to I think a lesser extent, the run up to the war in Iraq in 2002.
Sure.
There was also that, but even that was not on anything near the scale of the Vietnam protests. Which probably is another reason that I do this, is that I was involved in Vietnam protests in the late 60s when I was in high school, and in fact was kicked out of high school for that. And you know, I got tear gassed various times. So yeah, the war in Vietnam was such a completely immoral. I don't know. It's hard to put words to it. Killing 2 million Vietnamese, as well as 60,000 Americans, defoliating their crops, poisoning their water. There's still a very high rate of birth defects in Vietnam because of the dioxin we put in their water. It was entirely immoral, and it was the United States government doing it. And I think that to me indicated that the government just had no legitimacy whatsoever.
Back to our point a minute ago, our discussion a moment ago about the Occupy movement, and I think you said something to the effect that they need to have a purpose or some specific goals. And what would those be in your estimation? What should they be?
Well, getting money out of politics is something that affects nearly every other issue. That is, the reason that the financial system and the economic systems are rigged is because the folks who are elected to office are the folks who are chosen by the financial and economic elites. So, I mean, the Republican primary is a pretty interesting example of that, where you're either each of the candidates is supported by some other group of wealth. Newt Gingrich is supported by one casino owner in particular, but they're all supported by huge amounts of money flowing from corporate executives and corporations. And on the Democratic side, unfortunately, it's going to be pretty much the same thing. That the Obama campaign is now encouraging corporations and others to donate unlimited amounts to one or more super PACs to support Obama or to attack the Republican, whomever is the Republican candidate. And instead of fighting against Citizens United, what did Obama do? Well, he made a couple of comments about it in his State of the Union address, not this year, but last year, and then did nothing about it.
Why is that?
Well, he expects to get lots of corporate money too.
Mm-hmm. Someone suggested that if whoever wins the Republican primary, he will probably follow W's behavior in government. And I responded like, I don't see Obama doing anything different. So what's our choice now?
Well, I mean, it's how can he do anything different when basically the Bush team remained in place? I mean, it's the Bush economic team remained in place. That is, Timothy Geithner was a very high Fed official in causing the financial crisis. So he's made Secretary of the Treasury.
Yes.
He kept Bush's Secretary of Defense, and then he appointed a new Secretary of Defense, Panetta, it seems that his major purpose is to keep defense spending, increasing. I mean, he said that the cuts that would have been required by the bill from last summer that created the so-called super committee.
He is scary, Panetta.
That those cuts would totally decimate the military. We see that while the United States forces in Afghanistan are still at a near record high level, they've barely come down. There's still over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, and no one happens to mention that there are also 100,000 contractors, American contractors there, and that the so-called removal of troops from Iraq is going to leave 20,000 American paid-for security contractors there. So it is hard to see the difference. I think that Obama has made better appointments of the Supreme Court. That's absolutely true. But that's one important difference.
There's so many things I want to cover, and the time is running out. What's going to happen in Syria? With Assad?
Hard to say. I suppose Syria could end up like China, the People's Republic of China, which withstood protests back in 1989, Tiananmen Square and elsewhere, and simply suppressed them and withstood them. It may end up like Libya, which the regime did not survive in Libya, but of course there was round-the-clock bombing by European militaries that was facilitated by the United States, and hard to say.
Why do you think Russia and China are against intervening by the European powers in Syria?
I don't know. I can't explain that.
Do you think, I had a wild fantasy that maybe they're thinking that the U.S. is helping what's going on in Syria. They're going along with the Arab Spring. There must be a regime change, but they're positioning themselves to be sure they get the kind of regime replacing Assad that is supportive of American hegemony and America's control of the Middle East. And usually I can guesstimate what the heck's going on behind their behaviors, but this time I'm not sure.
It is confusing. Also, of course, there was the big uprising in Egypt, which doesn't seem to have accomplished anything. That is, it got rid of Mubarak. Of course, Mubarak was simply the titular head of a military dictatorship anyway. And so you get rid of the titular head and you're just left with the military dictatorship.
What's happened to the Arab Spring in those countries that threw off their dictators and their leaders? Has the U.S. managed to co-opt those revolts and put in regimes that are supportive of American hegemony?
I don't think so in Tunisia. In Libya, it remains to be seen because Libya doesn't actually have has done nothing to elect a government, or it's basically under the control of the rebel military, which is dependent upon Western and United States support. Egypt is still under the control of the Egyptian military, which gets Western and United States support. So we don't have a very good sample to go by.
Are we going to attack Iran, we being the U.S. and Israel?
I have no idea.
And a hunch?
No hunch. See how boring? I need my slides.
You're fine. So perhaps they don't need to attack. Well, someone suggested that the war against Iran has been going on for many, many years. It's just been increasing in intensity in recent years. So the attack would take the form of predator drones or attacking Iran's infrastructure and render it like Iraq is, and let's you and him fight.
Sometimes I wonder what the United States would think of Iran if Iran had come to the United States in 1958 and overthrown the democratically elected government of the United States and installed a king / Shah to rule the United States also by military dictatorship for 21 years, and then once the United States once again overthrew the Shah, then Iran would impose complete economic boycott, etc. So we've been involved in their affairs and taking over their government since the 1950s.
Is that a good thing?
No. No, I don't think so. You can imagine why what they feel about it, and that's why I think all of these interventions are counterproductive. Like in Afghanistan, what are we accomplishing there by bombing people, by killing people? And by taking over control of towns, villages, and cities? What exactly are we accomplishing? We're just causing people to hate us.
We're ensuring that the ruling elite, the super rich, are retaining their power and their riches, and pursuing, advancing American hegemony. Now, I'm going to have to stop talking now because they're going to yell at me again. It's close to time for us to stop visiting and get ready to say goodnight. To keep those pens and pencils handy in case you may want to jot down something we will show you in the closing credits. So a few public service announcements. But first of all, thank you, Dan, for coming on so much. I enjoyed visiting with you so much, and I'm sure my viewers are going to like this show too. All right? So public service announcement number one. Next, to get the Dr. Don Show local broadcast schedule, go to my website, www.donbaham.com, and click on present day activities. And if you want to get my shows on the web, go to www.donbaham.com and click on favorite links this time. There's over 200 shows that are available where I've interviewed all kinds of people like Dan and professors and truck drivers and whoever. Not as nice as Dan, though. And next, I want to tell you about the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm so grateful for the ACLU, and you've heard me say this before, which means it's really true. Without the ACLU, our civil liberties would be by the wayside, much worse than they are right now. Next, to get Dr. Don Show's broadcast by other stations in the country, ask your local public access station to go to www.pegmedia.org and learn how you can have a Dr. Don Show's broadcast in your friends or your relatives' local jurisdiction in Carolina or Florida or whatever. I have another one here for you, End Corporate Personhood Now. And we didn't talk about that too much, but to end corporate personhood, go to www.movetoamend.org. And I think we won't save democracy until we end corporate personhood and the power that corporations have. Do we have another one? Oh, no, huh? No. Remember, okay. Thank you for watching. And remember, KFC. Not that KFC, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind. Be kind. Be friendly, and be charitable. There it is. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time. And to you too. Be kind, friendly, and charitable to you too. And to you and to whoever's watching with you. Thanks again. And good night.